after me. I'm a man. I'm 40.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Nick DiMartino. That's Ben Kruse. This is a brand new episode of season. This is the first episode of season 2 of Moving the Goalposts. The first episode of 2025. And you can follow us across social media at MTGP ETB. You can follow the Empty the Bench podcast network across social media at ETB Network. You can follow me on Twitter at Nick DiMart, Ben at Ben Kruse 144. You can watch all Empty the Bench shows on youtube.com/ETB Network. You can listen to all Empty the Bench shows on etbpodcast.com. You can listen to Moving the Goalposts wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to like and subscribe. And this show, Moving the Goalposts, is presented by Playback. Watching sports is more fun with others, but we spend too much time watching alone. Playback is a virtual space where communities can stream live sports together with everyone perfectly synced up. Creators can hop on stage, deliver their own play-by-play analysis and commentary, and invite viewers up for Q&A. Playback makes watching sports fully interactive and a social experience. From playing fantasy sports, repping your favorite players and teams, and watching with the commentators and communities you care about. Win or lose, sports are best enjoyed together. Join our community by going to playback.tv/ETB Network to find out more, including our live stream schedule. All right. So, Ben, it's nice to have you back. And, we didn't start off the new year great. Well, we got to start off with the Sugar Bowl, which unfortunately started with a terrorist attack in New Orleans that ended up moving it to 4:00 the next day. I was sort of shocked at this. Obvious. I think all of us kind of were. There's not much to really say about it other than what everybody else is kind of saying about the terrorist attack. So I don't want to talk about it too much. But I do want to talk a bit about the game. Obviously, I do want to talk a bit about the game. What I will say is I actually think it's better that it was spread out a little bit more in terms of the scheduling. I think it makes a lot more sense to have one game on Wednesday and then one game on Thursday. That's when it was, right? Thursday. Rather than like having them all in one day. Like that's just I prefer the scheduling. Like I think that makes a lot more sense. That's the only thing I'll say about that. But yeah, Georgia kind of came back down to earth against Notre Dame. It's been a peculiar year in college football. It's been a peculiar year because Riley Leonard threw for under 100 yards, and they still ended up beating Georgia. There were a few pretty notable. Everybody's. What was your reaction to this game?
Yeah, well, first of all, my prayers and thoughts go out to the New Orleans community, of course, with the stuff that happened. I actually was coming back from my vacation trip from Florida, and I still remember when I got off the plane and I got to LaGuardia Airport, I saw a bunch of like the TV screens like by like the airport bars and stuff like that, and all like the coverage about like the game being canceled and stuff like that night. And I know that off the air in our Empty the Bench network, we got a bunch of our, callers basically saying in terms of how we feel about having the game pushed back just the day after. If it was the right idea, or maybe like a couple of days to kind of give like the city maybe like a little bit of like decompression and just like kind of waiting out a little bit. But I think all in all, the game itself, I just think that at least we've kind of seen at least so far with the playoff format is a lot of the teams that have been playing the first round have been just having the momentum and beating a lot of the teams that kind of a little bit about a bye. And I think maybe with the bye for a couple of teams, at least so far in this new playoff format, it's kind of, bit them in the ass a little bit. And I think that Georgia's still a really good team. But Notre Dame, I think, just was the better team that day as well. Riley Leonard, like you mentioned, didn't throw for a lot of yards, but they really were able to control in terms of they had a kick return for a touchdown. Their running game with Jeremiah Love is really, really stout, and their defense. I know that Carson Beck obviously didn't play in this game, but you saw what Georgia had, the game I think before, and Carson Beck was down in the first half, and Georgia had a really hard time with the football. And then the second half, they just were a brand new team. So I think that specifically Notre Dame was just the better team that day. They deserved it. And I think we're going to be in for a dandy come Thursday for the Peach Bowl when they take on Penn State.
Yeah. I think that a lot of – the interesting thing about this game is that everybody was talking about Parker Jones. Parker Jones was a defensive back on Georgia who never plays. And he was – I'm sure you know what I'm talking about when the ref ran into him, and that was a penalty, which could have cost Georgia a touchdown. I mean, we don't really even know that, but it did push them back a little bit. I'm not going to blame him. I mean, it seems like a lot of people are blaming this kid for that. The truth is, I don't think any one thing is the reason. I don't think any one particular thing is the reason they lost. It only costed them at most 4 points, and they lost by 13 points in total. They lost 23-10. So I find that a little hard to believe. I mean, a lot of people are talking about momentum, but I think that's complete BS because Georgia played much better in the first half than they did in the second half. So I can see that argument a little bit maybe if it happened in the second half, but this happened in the first half. If anything, the momentum went in the opposite direction. I don't think it was any one particular thing that caused this to happen. It really just wasn't. It was the game plan, if anything. I think the game plan did it. And the fact that Georgia struggled this year a lot. I mean, Georgia came back down to earth this year.
They did.
And, everybody's talking about it. Like, this is probably the worst Georgia team we've seen maybe since 2020.
Yeah.
Or maybe even the year before that, which we're not used to. We're used to seeing the Georgia dynasty, which, you also have to remember that's how most dynasties go. Dynasties don't last forever. I mean, the closest is Alabama. But, even the Roman Empire fell. So, and in college football, all the Roman empires of college football, most of them only last for a couple of years. So some of it makes a certain amount of sense, especially when so many of your best players haven't come back. Like so many of Georgia's best, namely Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey. So many, they haven't really recovered from that. They haven't really recovered from Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers and Brock Bowers leaving. Look, it's not Parker Jones's fault that Trevor Etienne fumbled, and it's not Parker Jones's fault that Notre Dame put up 23 points and Georgia could only put up 10. It's not his fault that all that happened. Even if they ended up getting that touchdown, who knows what would have happened afterwards? I mean, if you were to just look at it with some common sense, Georgia, I'm sure, would not have won anyway.
Right. Like you mentioned, we knew kind of for a fact this year that Georgia wasn't as good as in previous years. They were very similar to Alabama, in terms of just a whole lot of turnover. I know that obviously the coach didn't turn over, but when you have a lot of talent specifically, at least from the roster standpoint, and it starts to turn over, you can really see it. Georgia, Carson Beck obviously going down, even though Carson Beck, I'm not the biggest fan of that quarterback, but when you have him go down, and I know that the Stockton kid played pretty well, and he was only a freshman, so he could really be potentially their future, which might not be the worst thing for them. But I know that I just don't know specifically what the future is like for some of these teams. And I know we're going to talk about the SEC with some of these teams in a little bit. But, I think specifically, Georgia just wasn't the same this year. And you can make a case for a lot of the SEC teams this year as well.
Yeah, I mean, most of the teams that we're used to seeing as top teams, the top of the SEC, I would say, was not the same this year. I mean, or at least the traditional SEC teams. I mean, Texas is better this year than they were last year. But, they weren't an SEC team last year. All the SEC teams that we think of as top teams were not, like, namely Georgia and Alabama, that were not as good as they were last year. But, I mean, the one SEC team that I think was better than they were in previous years would be like South Carolina. I think they had a good year. Now, this always brings up the question of the SEC. And I will say, I think that conference collectivism is probably the stupidest cultural thing in college football amongst college football fans. There are very few things dumber than that. Like, it doesn't matter if they're like you don't see that in professional sports. You don't see NFL. You don't see Jet fans rooting for the Bills or the Patriots because they're in the AFC East or something like that. Like that, like when they're against non-AFC East teams.
Maybe us did yesterday, just for a certain reason only for the pick, but that's outside of that. But
right. But like we don't care about the AFC. We don't have an AFC East chant. AFC East, like SEC fans do.
Right.
Which all the bad teams in the SEC or mediocre teams in the SEC always want to ride the SEC wave without putting in any of the work. They're like the people who want to get like an A on the group project that didn't contribute. I mean, like, Florida, Vanderbilt, for not anymore, but for many years, Tennessee, all that. So I will have to preface that by saying it is the stupidest cultural aspect of college football, especially in today's era of like super conferences. But Georgia losing to Notre Dame does bring up the question of the SEC. And not even just that they lost to Notre Dame, this is just a part of it, but the whole season, has the SEC come down to earth a little bit? And to me, the answer, I think, is yes, they have. I mean, I think it's just obvious that they have. I'm not saying that they're a bad conference. I think they're arguably still the best conference, because they're still a fairly deep conference. But at the top, are they the best? They're not the best conference at the top. They're just not. I mean, Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, that combination is better than, say, Georgia, Texas, and Ole Miss, maybe, or Alabama. I don't know who that third team even would be. So I certainly do think that's true. And we're not used to seeing that. And it's just sort of like, I think that every year people say the SEC is overrated. People say that every single year. People love to say that because they're a great, they're like, it's just like an easy thing to say because the expectations are so high and the teams are human. Like, it's made up of college kids and teams are just not perfect. So people like to say the SEC is overrated. But to me, it is so obvious that they've at least come down to earth this year compared to where they were previous years. I don't know if that has to do with the transfer portal exactly. It could just happen to be that way. I mean, the fact that Nick Saban left Alabama has a lot to do with Alabama not being in the playoffs. So but I just think it's obvious. Regardless of the outcome of this game, it's just obvious.
Right. And I think that, eventually, like you were talking about, just teams kind of falling down to earth, just the overall conference, like it was bound to happen at some point, right? You see it both. I mean, I'm just looking at, the top 10 teams. Oregon, obviously that's non-SEC. Georgia, they're SEC. Texas, though, non-SEC. Penn State, non-SEC.
Texas is SEC.
Texas is a SEC. Thank you.
Now they are.
Yeah, now they are. But yeah, I mean, like Ohio State, Boise State, SMU, like there's a lot of teams now that are really, I think, more of the come up. And I think just as conferences, I think it's also better for college football. I think it's just me. It's not me being a personal bias by any means, but I just think just as an overall group, and now with the playoff format as well now too, I think that kind of start to take a little bit more of some outer conferences that maybe don't get the respect that they deserve. And I think it really kind of transform and make it in a way of like college football, I think deserves a little bit more of like just, a wide margin of just other conferences like starting to kind of show up, because there's a ton of teams out there that like, for instance, Boise State, Ashton Gents, right? maybe a couple of years ago you're like, oh, this is maybe just a really good running back, but like you can kind of see it against like a team like Penn State. I know he wasn't great, but like he broke millions of records left and right, and you wouldn't know a hole in the wall about him if he was not in the SEC at this point in time, right? There's more conferences I think that are just starting to get more recognition, and I think it's because we're going to kind of start to get more of a wide margin of more conferences, outside the SEC that might be more on the come up, and they might be more on the downhill a little bit.
Well, I think we would know about Ashton Genty in general. Like, I don't think.
Right.
I mean, like,
I'm just talking about like players specifically. I think that in the past there was a ton of players that were really good players in college, but they just weren't like getting a lot of media recognition. I know he did, but like just in general, because it's not like he was playing for like Alabama or like Georgia, or like a lot of those type of teams. He was playing for Boise State, and no discredit to Boise State, right? But like there's a lot of schools specifically that are more like smaller schools that might have a lot of great players that might be more on the come up. If they had a really good season, they get into the playoff and like, oh, like now we know more about it.
Right. No, that's definitely true. I mean, if Ashton Genty played at Alabama, he likely could have taken Alabama. I mean, maybe Alabama would have been a playoff team if Ashton Genty played at Alabama. Who knows?
Because the overall media coverage just be more like double to it. Like if Genty was on Alabama, just the coverage was big already. It's just the overall brand name itself. That's the biggest thing.
Right. We also, I mean, like with the 12-team playoff this year, I think it was. I mean, my issue, I would say, with the 12-team playoff this year is that it was a drastic change it was a very drastic change in just a very short amount of time. They went from 4 teams to 12 teams and thought that's a good idea to change something that quickly. It's like changing your diet. Like, it would be like if you eat, it would be like if you go from eating like a whole bunch of carbs to then doing keto within the span of 24 hours.
Yeah.
That might not be a good idea. Your body might not be able to adjust to that in 24 hours. So that's kind of what the college football playoff committee did with the 12-team playoff. I think a lot of people, I mean, I do think it's funny how much so like Miami and Alabama fans and Ole Miss fans were talking about a lot of the teams that were in the top 12 that got killed on the road, namely Tennessee, Indiana, SMU, and who am I forgetting? Indiana, SMU, Tennessee, and maybe who am I forgetting?
Oh, in the first round?
Yeah, Tennessee, SMU, Indiana, and
Boise State?
No, not Boise State. And
or in the first round, Clemson.
And Clemson.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, Clemson wasn't really all that bad, but people were talking about those those teams playing on the road in the first those teams playing on the road in the first round, and it was just like. And people were using that as a way to say, oh, those teams weren't worthy. But I mean, like, I think the truth is, I mean, especially coming from Alabama fans, which is very rich, and Miami fans who were.
Yeah. And you saw what happened to Alabama, by the way, in the bowl game, right? Where they played one of the worst Michigan teams, at least in a while. Of course.
The worst Michigan team in a decade.
Yeah. Of course, my Ohio State Buckeyes lost this Michigan team this year after just countless years of just losing to on a better streak. So, of course, that figures. But anyway. No, like Indiana, right? They weren't awful, but like you got all these Alabama fans, of course, figuring up. They'd be like, all right, it's why not us? Like, they obviously kind of saw what happened in that first round against Notre Dame. Like, oh, of course, like we should have been in. And then, of course, you look in terms of what happened there. The Requesta Bowl in Tampa, and you saw what happened there, and like, they just weren't. They weren't deserving to be there. Like if you shouldn't be losing to teams then like Vanderbilt and a lot of these other teams and basically getting, the hype and the media, recognition to go to the next step. Like you got to beat the teams you got to beat, and then you won't. It's like the Bengals, right? At least, and I hate to cross sports, but like the reason why they didn't get in the playoffs is they should have taken care of business kind of early on in the season and they didn't. it's kind of the same with Alabama. Like you've got to beat some teams, and then maybe you want to be kind of in a situation where you have to rely on other things to happen.
Yeah, I think that's true on some level. The difference is I think the Bengals are more worthy of a playoff of being in the
Oh,
playoffs than Alabama is.
definitely, but just kind of like the situation, like having to rely on other situations to happen to get in. That was the case.
Yeah, well, you're an Ohio State fan, and Ohio State redeemed themselves against
Whoa.
Oregon. Oregon was the overall favorites to win the whole thing, although they were actually 2.5-point underdogs against Ohio State. I mean, we forget that Ohio State only lost to them by 1 point on the road. So it's not exact. It wasn't exactly a given that Oregon was so much better than Ohio State. So it is interesting to me. This is an interesting phenomenon about Ohio State because if they end up, they're the favorites to win it now of the final 4 teams. They're the favorites, and if they end up winning it all, this would be the second time that they would have won a national championship due to the playoff expansion. In other words, they would have won the national championship when under the previous system, they would not have made the playoffs. Because 10 years ago when they last won it, it was they just got in as the 4th team in the 4-team playoff. So that I think would be fairly interesting. I do have, now you're an Ohio State fan. Now you're not as crazy as some other Ohio State fans. You're still from the Northeast.
Yeah.
But I will say, I think that you can only speak for yourself, but would you rather Ohio State have beaten Michigan this year or win the national championship?
Oof, that's tough. The Michigan thing, and I don't know because you look at that, right? And I think, I didn't get the chance to watch a lot of that game because I was working, but I found out from actually one of my coworkers right afterward when I was about to be done with my shit. He's like, "Oh yeah, by the way," because he knew I knew I was an Ohio State fan. He's like, "Oh yeah, they lost to Michigan." And I'm like, "You got to be effing shitting me this and that."
I thought the same thing. I woke up and saw, what? Ohio State lost to Michigan? They were bigger. They were 21 point. They were like 3 touchdown favorites, Ohio State.
Yeah, and I thought to myself, I'm like, if they're never gonna beat them, if they're never gonna beat them this year, then I don't even know what to say. And I knew for a fact maybe they beat Tennessee at their place. I'm like, all right, maybe like they'll win a game here and there, but like I told my brother, I'm like, there's no way. I mean, there was a chance. I'm obviously not giving them a chance because, like you said, they barely lost to them actually at Oregon early on the year. So it was clearly an advantage for Ohio State that like they wanted their revenge. And clearly in this game, I couldn't be any more proud of the way that the guys played. Will Howard has been absolutely phenomenal, at least so far. That's not even me being biased, like just the stats to show it. Oregon's defense, I didn't realize specifically Oregon's defense, if it wasn't just not good for that game or just the overall competition that they played, because Ohio State in that first half basically was able to do whatever they wanted to do. Oregon's defense, at least in that secondary, gave a ton of big-time plays. Jeremiah Smith, who is an absolute stud, who apparently said after the game that nobody can cover him. I mean, he is a really good big time player. And this is actually coming right after a year that one of the best Ohio State receivers, Marvin Harrison Jr., came live. So that basically speaks a lot of volumes. But you got Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, who had a touchdown in that first half, and then of course Trevion Henderson had a long one. I know Oregon kind of somehow made a game in that second half, at least earlier on, but Ohio State had a big enough cushion where they just really had to control the clock and the running game. And I know Ryan Day, I'm a very big critic about Ryan Day, of course, winning the big time games, kind of like with Penn State and James Franklin. I'm going to look at the top 4 now. I mean, Texas, of course, is going to be really tough, but I think it should be a really fun game. Now it's like sky's the limit with this team. Like, they already beat the number 1 team, of course, now in college football. And I think now everything at this point in time, I think it's obviously, championship or bust. So we'll see what happens. But at least so far, they've played really good football. And I think that come Texas, I have a really good feeling that there's a good chance we can win.
Wait, so what is your answer, though?
For what?
Michigan versus beating Michigan versus winning the national championship. You can't dodge the question.
Yeah, no, definitely national championship.
Okay, I figured you would say that.
Yeah, I think in terms of like my answer, even though I didn't firmly say the answer until now, kind of the way I was thinking, because Michigan just has something with Ohio. I mean, Ohio State always just there's something about Michigan that they just cannot get over consistently. I think it's just because Ryan Day just I don't know if he doesn't play aggressive enough, if he didn't play scares enough, but when you're talking about national championship. I think a little bit of that kind of takes away the state of like, all right, yeah, we won the national championship. So it's like, who cares? Right. You're obviously the top of the top. And it's like with a bunch of teams in the NFL, it's like, oh, there's this one team you just cannot beat consistently, but you won the Super Bowl. Right. I feel like the same way in this case. So yeah, definitely a national championship.
Yeah, okay. I agree. I think I'm not an Ohio State fan, so I don't feel any type of way about it. That makes the most sense.
Right.
Obviously, I think that makes the most sense. However, I do think the crazier of an Ohio State fan you get, the more likely you are to say, I'd rather beat Michigan. Well, I think that is also true.
Yeah, like, so for instance, right, if we somehow won the national championship this year, and it's a very good chance to, and, it's really hard to repeat as is. So it's like, all right, if you get the chance to win the national championship, and then the following year, maybe if you ask me the same exact question, I might lean towards going for Michigan because we already won it last year. So it's like, yeah, of course, it'd be a luxury to have it once again to repeat. But it's like, all right, we've really been struggling to get this done. Like, eventually, like, we got to get over the hump. It's like, it's absolutely ridiculous at this point in time.
Yeah. And yeah, Ohio State, they were just able to redeem themselves. That's really what they did. And that is something like my philosophy about college football when it comes to the playoffs is that there has to be a balance between allowing teams to redeem themselves who are good enough to be in the playoffs and not allowing in teams that really aren't good enough. Right. And that's a tough balance because we went from kind of one extreme to the other with a 4-team playoff to a 12-team playoff. It is obviously true that now teams are allowed to redeem themselves. It is also true that it did lead us to letting in teams that probably weren't good enough, realistically. Look, there's no perfect way of doing it. There always likely will be something where a situation where there could be a team that's good enough that doesn't get in or a team that really wasn't worthy that can still get in. That can always happen, but there needs to be some type of balance. That's always been my philosophy. And under the 4-team playoff and under the previous system, which was just picking 2 national championship teams, we've been robbed of a lot of teams that realistically probably were good enough to be in the playoff. I mean, so there's a few teams throughout the 4-team or college football playoff, or even 2-team that I think were good, that I can think of off the top of my head that realistically were good enough, and we were sort of robbed of seeing them actually compete in the playoffs. One of them is a whole lot of them in 2016. Michigan, the 2016 Michigan team, if they had just beaten Iowa, there's a good chance that they would have gotten in over Washington. USC in 2016, who they were not allowed to redeem themselves. They lost a few games early in the season, and after that, they ended up winning the Rose Bowl, and I think they probably could have competed with any of the playoff teams that year. They probably could have competed with Ohio State. It probably would have been a 2 or 3 point spread if they had played at a neutral site. Penn State that year. Penn State got a lot better. They beat Ohio State earlier that year. I think Penn State, that one year, we were robbed of 3 teams that really could have competed. Michigan ended up losing, I think it was the Orange Bowl that year, because a whole bunch of their players sat out, which is another problem with having too short. That's one good thing about an expanded playoff, which is that you don't have the issue of starters sitting out because the bowl game is just meaningless, and it just ends up jeopardizing their NFL career, their status as an NFL prospect. So that's one good thing about it. But Ohio State is it's almost like they're the first team. Like every other year, since the beginning of time, since the beginning of college football, the loss to Michigan would have just been the nail in the coffin. That would have just been it. Normally, that's what it would have been. The funny thing is now Chip Kelly seems to realize he has the best running backs and wide receivers in college football.
Yeah.
It's like he didn't realize that.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. And you're talking about at least Ohio State, at least redeeming themselves. it's not the fact that not only that they redeemed themselves, but it's the matter of like they still deserved enough, at least when I looked at the big picture, that they should be in the overall college football playoff. And I know that obviously losing to Michigan was a bad loss. Like, don't get me wrong. But like there's a ton of other teams that don't get this opportunity because like, yeah, like they got in, but like were they deservingly enough to be in? And I think, Ohio State and Oregon, like we talked about, Ohio State legitimately, if Will Howard didn't pull a Dak Prescott moment during the regular season right at the end in which he slid, during midfield with the time expired, I still don't understand why. I mean, I can now laugh at that because
I do understand why.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to do. I mean, Nico Iamaleava did the same thing, actually.
Right. No, I mean, he a mistake happened like that. It was a massive brain fart for him, but like he redeemed himself, right? We talk about redeeming himself. He went, to the Rose Bowl, played the same exact team, and put an absolute masterpiece out there on the biggest stage. So, I think, and I don't know if we're gonna get the chance to talk about, the next games coming up, but like, this was I thought it'd be a lot closer, to be honest. I mean, obviously, I was happy enough that they won. But Oregon, I also look at them too. I thought just as an overall season, because they were undefeated coming to this game, is like, yeah, they're a good team. But I don't know. There's been a lot of chatter about like how many physical teams they truly played. Because I know that there's been a phenomenon, at least in their overall conference, that they don't play a lot of physical teams, and Ohio State is one physical team.
Well,
I could be wrong about that, but yeah, true. But I don't know. Like, when was the last time really Oregon has won anything specifically when it's mattered too? That's another thing that I don't really truly know. But at least there might be a certain case where like they get in at like the biggest stages and they really haven't won the big time thing.
Well, they won the Big Ten championship game.
Yeah, that's something
In their first year. That's pretty good, I'd say. We've seen a lot of good Oregon teams.
No, I'm not saying that there haven't been a lot of good teams. There have been a lot of great teams, but it's the just consistency, like, of excellence compared to like a lot of the teams that have won at a higher stage.
But with the schedule, I'd say Oregon really got hosed. I'm not saying I think based on how they played against Ohio State, I'm not saying I think they would have ended up winning at all.
Right.
But undoubtedly, it is obviously true that they got hosed. I mean, as much as Dan Lanning is not going to say that publicly because he wants to hold his team accountable and himself accountable, most importantly. Yeah. And that, you just got to win games. So based on how they played against Ohio State, they probably wouldn't have won the whole thing anyway. But objectively speaking, they would have been better off losing to Penn State. If they ended up losing to Penn State and then played SMU and Boise State in the first two rounds, obviously they would have been better off. And they would have obviously they would be in the Final Four and they'd have a better shot. I mean, if any team should have had this fate, if anything, it should have been Penn State. So that's the problem with the seeding and how it works, is that we like to pretend, a lot of college football fans, or not even, a lot of it's just sports fans who aren't college football fans, like to pretend that these like underdogs that win their conference are much better, or, come close to winning their conference or whatever, are much better than they really are. I mean, like, I think everybody wanted to believe that Indiana, SMU, and Boise State were much better than they really were, when in reality they didn't. I'm not saying they weren't playoff worthy or shouldn't have gotten a shot, but we like to believe that those teams are better than they really are, because, in college basketball, we see a whole lot of upsets. And because we see it in college basketball, well, you're going to see it in college football too. Well, college football is a different game than college basketball.
It's all different.
It's a totally different game. Upsets are not as common. And the truth is, a lot of these teams are not as good as we like to believe they are, because we like to root for underdogs. But in reality, Boise State isn't that good of a team. Neither was SMU or Indiana. I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't have been in the playoffs, but that's the problem with the 12-team playoff, which is that the bottom of it might not be that good. The bottom of it might not be that good. And I think that was a big part of the problem with.
Boy, you also saw too a ton of blowouts in the first round, and a ton of people are like, "Well, why is there so many blowouts?" It's like, all right, like I mean, yeah, of course, we probably weren't expecting it consistently, but like you were talking about, like, there's a ton of teams that, like, yeah, they got in specifically, but were they a lot better than their record indicated from what they specifically played during the regular season?
Yeah. I mean, in fairness, a lot of these types of blowouts happened under a 14 playoff too.
Sure,
So
sure.
a lot of that, you never know. It's very difficult to evaluate teams. It's especially difficult now. I mean, like I was talking about conference collectivism. And it made a little bit of sense previously, but now in the era of like super conferences, it's so especially stupid. It's especially stupid because with the super conferences, some teams play much more difficult schedules than others. I mean, if you look at a team like Missouri, they're in the SEC, but they played an easier schedule than most Big Ten teams. Indiana's a Big Ten team, but their schedule was not much better than most ACC teams. So being in a tough conference doesn't mean that as that specific team plays a more difficult schedule. What matters is your actual schedule. That's what actually matters. I mean, Texas and Ole Miss played much more favorable schedules than Georgia and Alabama. That's just painful. That's just so obvious. So I mean, look, Ohio State is playing Texas. My question is, how good is Texas? We don't really know. They're kind of a tough team to evaluate. They've played a fairly favorable schedule. I think they're a talented team offensively. They were lucky to beat Arizona State. There's a good chance they lose that game if they make the correct call and call that a targeting.
Oh, my God.
On Texas, which Arizona State could win that game, has an opportunity at least to win that game. It was targeting, obviously. It was an obvious target, and you always I saw Doug Gottlieb tweet out and he deleted the tweet, but he said, is it targeting? Yes. Do you call it in that situation? No. It's like, that's just stupid. That is obviously just stupid. I mean, like, it's either targeting or it's not.
Yeah, no, he basically he basically said, was it targeting? And then, of course, then he said no at the same exact point. You look at the overall play, and I think the majority, at least a lot of the people on social media, basically said that was and there was some Texas fans that I saw, I think on X now that we call it. They're like, oh my God, that's a clear target. I mean, everybody specifically saw that call. And it's not just the overall call itself, but it's just the timing of it, right? Theoretically, I think it was on a third down or a second down. I think, they were about to go about midfield, 15 yards downfield, and they were going to be in position with about, I think, 20, 15 seconds, or at least within under a minute of them to win this football game. And instead, they didn't get the call. And I mean, to be fair, right, they still had a chance in overtime. It was generally a stop away. Texas was able to tie that game. So, they want, especially in that situation, I really didn't understand the call that Arizona State had where they did literally a blitz, like an all-out blitz on a fourth down, in which specifically what I would have done is basically play prevent defense, because you look at the overall play in that touchdown, and Ewers basically made a check at the line, and he threw it to Golden right in that back pylon, and nobody essentially was inside. I'm like, what are you doing? Like,
they shouldn't have blitzed. What I think they thought was, it seemed like they thought that Quinn Ewers couldn't throw.
Yeah, no.
Or maybe they were like, if you're going to beat us, you're going to beat us in the pass game or something like that. It was a bad play call.
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing about like blitzing, like of course, and during the game, but the timing of the blitz, specifically in that case on a fourth down where you just need one stop, you just can't have anything just get to the end zone. In that case specifically, it wasn't not only got into the end zone, but just you look back and it's like how did that happen? And then, of course, I knew for a fact because, of course, the next play after the second overtime, Texas took the lead. I'm like, that was their chance. As much specifically as the targeting call really sucked, a lot of, unfortunately, in sports, there's a ton of situations where you're going to get specifically just, called against. And then, of course, it's like, well, you're going to have to figure a way to bounce back. And it's one thing if Arizona State really didn't get that chance to specifically redeem themselves. They had a chance, but I know we talked about redeeming. They had a chance to redeem themselves in that first overtime, especially on a fourth down, and specifically defensively, they made the worst exact type of play when it's needed most at a certain time, and Texas took advantage of it. So part of it was on them for the loss for themselves. Yes, of course, they got hosed specifically at the worst time, but they also didn't, help themselves to try to get themselves back into winning that game either.
Yeah. I think that part is just obvious. Like when it comes to like targeting calls and fouls and things like that, I am not one to say that like, well, according to the letter of the law, it says this. It's like, well, that's not exactly accurate because I mean, look, the speed limit on a lot of highways is 65.
Yeah.
The posted speed limit. The real speed limit is more like 80 a lot of times. Like, you're not going to get pulled over unless you go like 80. Like, realistically, it's 80. Like, so I'm a big fan. So I would understand why you're like, well, I could understand why somebody who's going like 70 in a 65 is like, why am I getting pulled over? They're going 70 in a 65. That's not really the deal that we have. Yeah. So I get all that. Like, it's the same thing in sports. It's like, there can be gray area. However, what I'm not in favor of is saying, well, the moment is too big, therefore we don't call it when we would have called it at any point in the game. Yeah. That's what I'm opposed to. Like, I am not one to say, like, I think it should be consistent. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. It should be consistent with how the rest of the game is called, which is what I said about the BYU-Utah game. Why BYU, they shouldn't have made that call against Utah. Mm-hmm. Because they weren't calling that all game. They weren't calling like ticky-tacky things all game. Then at the very end, they finally call it. It's like, you got to be consistent. And that's the extent of what I'll say about that. So onto the NFL. The Bengals missed the playoffs. I know somebody who's going to be very happy about this.
Yeah.
I think that it is actually, in a weird way, a travesty that the Bengals missed the playoffs. We were talking about teams that, good. I mean, look, we don't have selection committees in the NFL. And I'm not blaming anybody except the Bengals, but I do think it's a travesty that the Bengals are not in the playoffs. They have a really good offense. Their defense kind of stinks. I'll give you that. A team that they just previously beat is now in over them because a team that would otherwise certainly have beaten them rested all their starters. I don't blame them for doing that at all. I don't blame the Chiefs for resting all their starters because that's just the smart thing to do. And I that's just a smart thing to do. Obviously, you don't want to risk any of your best players getting injured. It doesn't matter if you lose the game anyway. So I don't blame them for that. But I do think it's a bit of a travesty that, I do think it sucks that these types of things happen in rivalry games. Like, I do think that I don't like very much, which is that, like, I think if anything, I'd rather this be like, if anything, if the Chiefs are going to rest their starters, if anything, I'd rather it be against a team like the Panthers or something like that. Like, which rather than a rivalry game between the Chiefs and the Broncos. Imagine if Ohio State and Michigan played and just Ohio State just rested all their players. Like, that would be ridiculous. So I think that might be, like, I prefer these types of things not happen in like rivalry games, but I don't blame the Chiefs for doing it at all. They did the right thing, obviously. And I also think that they kind of wanted to lose that game because they would rather the Broncos be in that last spot than the Bengals, because the Bengals are way more likely to beat them. I mean, like, just by any objective measure, if the Broncos roll into Arrowhead Stadium, the spread's going to be a lot bigger than if the Bengals do. And I think it also begs the question, how is Joe Burrow like the best? He's one of the best quarterbacks I've ever seen. Joe Burrow, 2024 Joe Burrow. He's one of the best quarterbacks I've ever seen to miss the playoffs. He's got to be. He's one of the best quarterbacks. Maybe it's Aaron Rodgers in some years at Green Bay or something like that. I'm trying to think. There are some years Dan Marino, certainly, but that's before my time. Might as well not happen. If it was before I was born, it doesn't count. I'm just saying from what I've seen, he might be the best quarterback I've ever seen to miss the playoffs.
Yeah. And we were talking about at least the Bengals. I mean, at least earlier on our football forecast shows in terms of they were so close in a lot of their games that they had the losses for. And I kind of had a feeling that basically would, hurt them down the road because they're always known for being a slow starting team. Like, I'm not surprised specifically of the slow start that they had. I just knew for a fact, like, they're too good of a team, at least offensively, where they would get themselves going, but it was really their defense that killed them for a lot of the season, and it was their coaching. I mean, heck, Lou Anarumo just got fired today from their defensive coordinator position on Black Monday today. It sucks because, like, Joe Burrow in the playoffs, I think is really good for the game, especially with a lot of the other quarterbacks. You look at Mahomes, you look at Allen. Like, if you had And this is obviously no discredit to the Broncos because the Broncos, of course, have not been in the playoffs for a long period of time. Bo Nix has really been a great overall story this year in terms of one of the best rookies in the class. And, give him credit. Give the Broncos a lot of credit. But, like, in terms of, like, media coverage, in terms of, like, an overall game, do you think most people are going to be more excited to see the Broncos at the Bills or the Bengals at the Bills. I think a lot of people are going to want to rather see Joe Burrow against Josh Allen. And this is, like I said, no discredit to Bo Nix, but like we've already seen that Joe Burrow and Josh Allen show in the past, and it was a great game. And, I remember it was a snow game. Burrow, of course, went into Buffalo and won that game. So it's like the Bengals kind of like like I said before, they kind of did it to themselves because they just never really got themselves kind of going in the first half of their season. Their coaching killed them, their defense had killed them. And if they played any type of defense, at least in the first half of the season, because I do feel like their defense was starting to kind of click, at least the second half, at least to the end of the season, they would have been definitely a playoff team. And just, you can't really blame the quarterback because Joe Burrow was phenomenal. Jamar Chase is a Triple Crown winner. He's one of the best receivers in the game. They're obviously going to probably pay. I mean, a lot of people think that T. Higgins is going to walk the market. I don't think he will, honestly. I think that the Bengals honestly should bring him back because they have a great thing going for them. They're definitely going to pay the bag to Jamar next year. So I think that the Bengals still, if there's any team specifically, and I said this last year, I thought that this year they redeemed themselves and getting back to the playoffs, but they just need some sort of defense, at least early on in the season, and they would be right there. So kind of sucks because the team, like you said, the team that they just beat, the Steelers, they're in the playoffs. 2 weeks ago, they played the Broncos.
I forgot about the Steelers, which just happened.
The Broncos, they just beat a couple weeks ago, and specifically the Broncos are in the playoffs against the team that the Bengals could have played, right? So it's just the whole entire thing was just a mess, at least on their part. And I think there's a ton of blame, at least, for a lot of situations, of errors.
If they had if everything else in their rough season had gone the same exact way, except they had managed to just squeak out a win over New England in week 1. Now, I understand it's the fallacy of a predetermined outcome. I get that. But they had just squeaked out a win against the Patriots in week 1, they would be a playoff team. So I'm not crying for them. I'm just as a fan, it kind of sucks.
Yeah.
That one of the 5 best quarterbacks in the NFL is not in, which I think certainly is a top 5 quarterback this year, is not in the playoffs. I think that sucks, especially when they just beat 2 teams that are going to be in the playoffs.
Right.
So
back weeks too.
That for me just sucks. I think that if the Bengals played the Chargers, the Steelers, if they played the Chargers, the Steelers, or Denver, they'd be favored.
Yeah,
I think they would beat. They just did. I think they beat the Chargers. They just beat the Steelers and the Broncos.
Yes, Steelers you can make an argument for because the Steelers you beat them once, but the Steelers are more.
The Steelers are playing now. I think the Bengals would beat them. I think teams just change a bit.
Yeah, no, the Steelers definitely for a fact, at least offensively, they've really came down to earth.
Yeah, and by the way, I didn't bring up this team either. The Texans. I think they beat the Texans. I think that. They won their division, so it's not an argument, really. And by the way, there's no selection committee in the NFL, so it doesn't matter. I'm talking about it almost like a college football fan. So that part doesn't even really matter. I think they're better than the Texans. For sure, I think they're better than the Texans. I think I've really cooled off. I've cooled off on the Chargers, the Steelers, and the whole season I was cooled off on the Texans. I don't think
that it's good. Really hard to pick the the Texans just have been – they beat the Titans, but the Titans are one of the worst teams in football. Of course, that was kind of understandably deserved, but against the better teams, at least all year, the Texans just been so inconsistent. I understand that, of course, pray for Tank Dell, but Tank Dell, of course, got down, and Stephon Diggs, obviously that would have helped them, but even with them, CJ Stroud, I love CJ, of course, I'm an Ohio State fan, and he just, of course, the sophomore slump, I think it kind of hit him. I think he was good. But I don't think that obviously he was at the same trajectory as he was last year because last year was just, of course, absolutely phenomenal. And I think a lot of people were just thinking that he would have the same exact type of season this year. It just never worked out.
Yeah. And also, I know one team, a lot of people are criticizing the Eagles for resting their starters against the Giants, with Saquon potentially breaking Eric Dickerson's record. For me, it was just I think they did the right thing. Just objectively, it was obviously the right thing. It's way more important. The future of the team is way more important than Saquon Barkley breaking Eric Dickerson's record. He was 100 yards away. Look, he's been averaging over 100 rushing yards per game. But you have to remember, they're playing all their backups, the Eagles.
Yep.
If Saquon Barkley gets hurt, that's likely the end of the Eagles' playoff chances. And he'd have the backup offensive line. He'd have the backup offensive line blocking for him.
Yeah.
So obviously, like, it sucks with that, in a rivalry game like the Eagles and Giants, although, I mean, one team is way better than the other. But it sucks that in a game like that, the Eagles are resting all their starters. I think that's just the problem with Week 17 games being rivalry games. I think that's something that maybe should change in the scheduling. Maybe maybe they should play Week 16 and having, like, the bad games be in Week 17, like I said, the Chiefs and the Panthers. If the Chiefs are going to rest all their starters, I'd rather it be against a team like the Panthers than against a team like than against Denver. I'd rather have gotten a game against Denver.
Well, yeah, and especially too, a lot of these rivalry type of games, at least this year, there's a lot of teams that were resting their starters because they knew they were playoff teams. Like, it'd be one thing if, like, the Eagles and the Giants just weren't good teams and they basically kind of played it out as, like, a game that really didn't mean anything. But no, yeah, like 100%. Like, Saquon Barkley, like, you look at Eagles last year, AJ Brown played in legitimately more of a meaningless game at the end of their season, and he was able to play in their wildcard game at Tampa Bay, and of course it kicked them in the ass. So it's a really important thing to have. But like you said, like, there's a ton of course, like, you look at, like, kind of like interleague in baseball, like interleague at least out of conference and football. And they definitely should kind of have a lot more of those games, specifically for the last game of the season.
Yeah. So briefly, I want to talk about this. The Patriots fired Gerard Mayo. I will just say this: it was an odd hire in the first place, and it's odd to fire him when he has a makeshift roster that Bill Belichick couldn't succeed with either. The only reason I think this might have happened is because they want to hire, like, Mike Vrabel.
So this is what I'm going to think about. All right, because a couple weeks ago, Adam Schefter went on, at Pat McAfee or whatever, and a couple other, like, media guys. And they're like, yeah, like, unless there was a massive, like, makeshift of, like, a blowout game a couple weeks, like, the next couple weeks after, like, they might consider their thinking. But I think a lot of people were thinking, at least for this point in time, that it's a rebuild type of season. Like, you basically how you had, and you kind of had a feeling that he was going to maybe come back and maybe improve the roster. I think a lot of people pretty much were, kind of getting that overall presumption. I think that blowout loss to the Chargers really opened a ton of people's eyes, including at least the Crafts. And they kind of look at this and be like, all right, because Robert Kraft actually went on the podium today, and somebody from the Boston reporters were asking, when exactly did you think that this fire was going to happen? And he basically said that he never told Mayo after the game yesterday. He basically pretty much made the decision right after the game was over. So I think specifically it kind of was behind closed doors. I think that Mayo, of course, understood it. I also think, too, that Kraft basically kind of said that he didn't feel like he was ready, at least for the job, even though that they brought him in. It's almost kind of like they had already a plan in place, but they wanted to give this an overall kind of, I want to say this like a bridge. It's like a bridge type of quarterback, like kind of like not being ready, but it's kind of like a bridge head coach. Like, they kind of had to have somebody just brought in, like, kind of familiar with the system. And I think that Mayo could be a good head coach. I really do think so. But he basically got a bad type of roster kind of thrown to him. And it's almost like you're getting thrown into an overall, like, sticky situation, and you're just basically just hoping for the best is going to work out. And he basically was the scapegoat for it. Like, unfortunately, that was the case. And like, now I think, of course, it's going to come down to Mike Vrabel or Ben Johnson. I do think that like an offensive-minded coach with Drake Maye, I think would do wonders for him, because now we know for a fact that he's a long-term quarterback. So I do think there might be something there potentially. But yeah, like, I'm very indifferent about it. I'm really sad for Gerard that it was only a year coaching with the team. But I do think that there are better, guys that are ready. I think that there was a leadership problem this year with the team, and I do think that there was something specifically that I was kind of, against with Mayo was beliefs and stuff like that. So it just sucks that he had to go so quick. And I think that the firing specifically, or at least right after the game, was very eye-opening. So we're going to have to see. I think that the process is going to go really, really quick, at least maybe even this week, in terms of we find out for our new head coach. But yeah, it kind of is unfortunate. But I do think the last couple of weeks basically kind of did the fans in, and they basically made a message of like, all right, something has to change.
Yeah. I agree with all of that. And the future of the New York Jets. All right. So it may have been Aaron Rodgers' last year as a Jet. I don't know if that's true or not. None of us really know until he goes on his darkness retreat.
Oh yeah.
So that makes it kind of difficult. I will say, I mean, look, he's 40 years old. He's coming off a 41, I think, actually. He's coming off an Achilles injury, which is very tough to recover from. I also so all that is undoubtedly true. He will be in the NFL another year unless he decides to retire. A team's going to pick him up. A team will pick him up. It might not be the Jets that he's on, but I
got
guess
a great team for him, by the way. I was going to just say Tennessee, because Tennessee is always a place with older guys that players go to die with. And I think that he's pretty much right at the end of his career, where like we looked at it this year with the Jets, at least, Nick. And I don't think Aaron Rodgers. I don't think there was obviously like some points of the season that like it was like okay, like the old Aaron, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like I don't think he's completely cooked. I think that specific there was a ton of stuff around him, maybe that, like, yeah, of course, was still a little bit of blame on the quarterback, but like I think you look at it and be like, if you're retired, it's like, yeah, like you could definitely see him play like for a couple of years, kind of the way that he played this year. But you can also kind of understand of like, all right, this could be at the same time. Like a lot of the times when a guy's really done, it's basically like they just physically could not play anymore. I don't think Aaron Rodgers at that stage right now is like, I physically can't play. I think that he still has a couple of years left, good years left in him. I think just like he has to just get a good, minded coach, honestly, and maybe other things kind of around him. But I still think he could really play if he really wanted to.
I will say, in fairness, he's actually substantially better than Peyton Manning was when he won the Super Bowl.
Wow.
I mean, he was. I mean, just for anybody who remembers.
Yeah.
When he won the Super Bowl, his second Super Bowl, yeah, Rodgers is better than he was. So I'm not saying he's going to win a Super Bowl. I'm just saying he can still play.
Yeah.
He might not want to, but he still can.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Jet, everything's just so up in the air with them. Did you see this lawsuit, which Skip Bayless was named in? With all of these wild accusations. So there were some really big ones at Fox Sports. And so, look, none of us know. It would be irresponsible for any of us to say that any of these things are true or not. I have no idea. They're just accusations. But some of them are a little crazy. Look, some of them seem too cartoonish to be true.
Mm-hmm.
But you never know. I mean, a lot of things seem too cartoonish to be true. And that are actually true. So look, I don't know. I'm just saying I don't know. But some of these are just crazy. These accusations are just crazy. And like I said, I'm not saying they're true or they're not. So here's one of them. Skip Bayless allegedly offered just for some backstory, the hairstylist Nushin Faraji is filing this lawsuit, and she's alleging that Skip Bayless offered her $1.5 million for sex.
Oh. Yeah, no, that's like
in response to her saying she might have cancer. That is
that's wild.
I don't know if, like I said, I don't know if any of this is true. That is crazy. That is a crazy amount of money to spend. I mean, and apparently, and this is what it says in the lawsuit, that Mr. Bayless made another advance at Miss Faraji, and it says Skip, and it says that she said to him, "Skip, stop, you have a wife." And Mr. Bayless responded, "Aren't you Muslim? Doesn't your dad have 3 to 4 wives?" What the hell? I mean, look, everybody likes to hate on Skip Bayless. He's somebody people like to hate. I will say I think he's amazing as a TV personality because people like to hate him. People have strong opinions about him.
Right.
I don't think that seems like him from his public persona. He seems like somebody who just has a lot of hot takes, not necessarily somebody who, is doing all of these inappropriate things.
Yeah.
But some of these accusations are so wild, they almost look like parody. And the other one is that Joy Taylor was named the moderator of Undisputed because of her alleged affair with Dixon.
Well, I thought it was Vinny Sharp. No.
What?
I thought Joy Taylor and Shannon Sharp kind of had a little thing going.
I don't think that that's what it's saying. Although that's not what it's saying. Which is pretty wild. It was Emmanuel Acho, actually. I think
Emmanuel Acho. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, like we were talking about, this is already presumption of like, we don't know if it's really truly the case, but like, yeah, of course, with the parlor giving, millions for sakes, I think is just absolute ludicrous.
Like, that is such a waste of money. That's like that is like worse than parking at Yankee Stadium.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely crazy if that was the case. I think, like you said, I don't think that he's the type of guy that would really do anything type of like that. He just is very bold when it comes to takes on shows, and he gets a lot of backlash. And of course, that happens. That's for a lot of media guys, they get backlash for a lot of things. But like truly, in terms of an actual person, I don't know. We can go on for days and days about specifically if it's really
look, like we've just said, but we don't know anything about this lawsuit or if any of it's true or not. I'm just saying. I will say this: it was a win for social media because the memes that we have gotten because of this were amazing. Yeah, like the memes were so funny from this, and so that had to have been the best part of this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we love to talk about sports media drama on this show. Because some of it is just the best stuff to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so we're nearing the end of the show. I have to end this with unnecessary wagers, of course. Hold on a second. I got to log into my DraftKings account. It's another it might be more unnecessary than the previous ones. All right, here it is. All right, so here it is. Chargers -2.5 against Houston. I was just talking about this. Look, I've cooled off on the Chargers, but I really don't think Houston is that good.
2.5?
-2.5. That's it. And by the way, it's -120.
Oh, the money.
So it maybe should be even bigger. Maybe 3 is probably a more appropriate spread. So 3 would be like maybe -110.
Yep.
Bills -8.5 against Denver. I really like the Bill. Like I said, I don't think Denver is that good.
They're going into also really like a Buffalo team, especially the Buffalo's so good at home in the playoffs too. They're just a different beast. I think maybe they could, cover potentially the 8.5 potentially. But I don't see them winning outright.
Yeah. Vikings money line against the Rams. That is, look, depends on which Sam Darnold we get. If we get the Sunday night Sam Darnold we had,
that's Sam Darnold all over again Sunday night, to say the least. So
look, everybody has bad games. They went 14-3. The Vikings are a good team.
Yeah, no, they're still a good team.
They're just unlucky that they're in a powerhouse of a division.
Right. You don't know with Matt Stafford, too. You don't know what type of Matt Stafford you're really getting either, to be fair. So it could be kind of a quarterback situation of like who just really, plays the best. If I'm going to go with a team specifically, I'm going to go with experienced defense, and I'm probably going to go with Minnesota. I think really with the Rams, they're kind of an unknown type of team. With the Vikings, you kind of have a pretty good picture of kind of what they are. I think that loss they had yesterday, I think that's more kind of an outlier than anything because their defense typically is pretty good. And there are a couple takeaways. It was more of their offense yesterday, which has been more of their stronger suit.
Yeah.
They just kind of came down to earth. But to be fair, they played a really good team at a really tough environment. So
I think the Lions are the best team in the NFL.
Yeah. I think it's, either really them or the Chiefs, but I think the Lions really now make the case to be the best team.
Yeah. So now there's now I have a Cotton Bowl 4-pick parlay between Ohio State and Texas. I like over 53.5. Quinshon Judkins, Quintravion Wisener, and Jeremiah Smith all as anytime touchdown scorers. On Forever Power 5, I'll be giving my pick. Jeremiah Love and Nick Singleton as anytime touchdown scorers in the Penn State Notre Dame game.
Okay, I like that too.
Yep. And then in the Steelers Ravens game, I have the Steelers +10. I don't think they're going out right, but Steelers +10.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Lamar Jackson, 50 or more rushing yards, and Derrick Henry, 100+ rushing yards.
Yeah, I mean, look, to be fair with the Steelers, even though that the Ravens, I think, are going to win this game, the Steelers always play the Ravens tough because they're in division, and the Steelers defense always seems to give Lamar Jackson out of any other team the most difficulty, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that, and I think I picked Ravens no cover against them during the regular season. I feel like the same in the playoffs. I really do. I just think that in division that you have the familiarity, and I just think that. I'm going to go Ravens no cover. Derrick Henry, I'm going to go with the 100 plus for sure. And Lamar Jackson, you said 50?
Yeah, 50 or more, 50 plus rushing yards.
I'll probably hammer the over by not maybe like 75, kind of around there.
You think it'll be that high?
Yeah, I think so, because I do feel like they're gonna have to run the football. The Steelers, I do think have a really good pass rush. So I think that obviously to avoid the pass rush, they're gonna have to do other ways, and that's to run the football. So if they're running an attack and the Ravens have a really good running attack, I could definitely see it happening.
All right, I can see that. All right, so that's our show this week. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I'm Nick DiMartino. That's Ben Kruse. You can follow me on Twitter at Ben Kruse, at Ben Kruse144. You can follow the Empty the Bench Network across social media at ETB Network. You can follow Moving the Goalpost across social media at MTGP ETB. And we will be back next week. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Take care, guys.